Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we explode modern myths and we question the assumptions and the conclusions of the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to explore the issue of cholesterol. We've all heard that we must reduce the number of eggs we eat and how we shouldn't eat butter and all this stuff. For decades this enduring myth has been with us. And to help us look at some of the facts, I'm joined this week by Dr. Jonny Bowden. And he began his career, I believe, as a personal trainer. He's an expert in nutrition and weight loss. He has a PhD in nutrition. He also, I think, has a master's degree in psychology and counselling. And he's written so many books that I can't remember all of them. But this is my favourite at the moment. And the subject of this discussion is called The Great Cholesterol Myth. And this is the myth that he's going to help us shed some light on this week. Dr. Jonny Bowden, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great
Thanks
stuff.
for having me.
So, Dr. Bowden, maybe you could kick us off with letting us know a little bit how did you learn so much about cholesterol? Because I've read quite a lot about the subject, and your book, just stood out as being very clear, concise, and it contains all the information. How did you get into all this stuff?
Well, it's funny. You were right. I started my career in 1990 as a personal trainer with no training in nutrition other than what we learned as personal trainers, which was pretty much outdated even back then. But we all bought it. It was a low-fat diet, lots of exercise, the calorie model of gaining weight. Take in more calories than you burn up, you gain weight, and if you burn up more than you take in, you lose weight. And it was as simple as balancing a checkbook. Yeah. And that's what we all learned, and that's what we all believed. And around 1992 or so, there started to come out some significant research on low-carb diets. And the Atkins diet, which had first been published in the United States in the 70s, had just been published in its third edition, right around early 90s. Okay. So low-carb was in the air a lot, and Atkins was in the air a lot. And we trainers thought that that was crazy. We thought that this was absolute medical malpractice, telling people to eat saturated fat, saying bacon was better than bagels. This was heresy. It was heresy. You can't even imagine. And we believed that. But many of our clients, myself and other trainers, were not doing well on low-fat diets. They were doing what we told them. They were on that treadmill all day. They were on that Stepmaster, and you see them. Everybody listening to this has been to the gym and seen people who are considerably overweight. I mean, noticeably, sitting there on that bike day after day doing it, and they're eating the low-fat diets and the bagels and the this and that, and it's not working. So some of our more frustrated clients came to us, and I remember for me, I'll speak of my experience, and said, look, I'm going to try this Atkins thing. People are saying it's great. And we'd say, you cannot do this because you might lose a few pounds. But what's going to happen to your cholesterol? What's going to happen to your heart disease? What's going to happen to your blood pressure? You're going to die. Except they didn't, Nigel.
Right.
They didn't. And they came back, many of them, not only looking better and feeling better, but they'd go to their doctor and their labs were better. Triglycerides would plummet. And, we're so imprisoned by our belief system. I remember starting my fourth edition of the book, I'm jumping ahead, the Living Low Carb. I told this story, which I'm about to tell you, which is to show you how imprisoned by our belief systems we are. I had one patient in particular who had just done spectacularly well on Atkins type high-fat diets. And she went back to her doctor about a year after her last exam, and she had lost all this weight, and he looks at the labs and he says, holy moly, Mrs. Jones, this is fantastic. You've lost 27 pounds. Your blood pressure is down considerably. You're out of the hypertensive range. I mean, this is amazing. What are you doing? And she says, I'm on the Atkins diet. And he says, you can't do that. I don't kill you.
Shock horror.
Right. So that's kind of how it was, except I didn't say, when they came back to me, I said, wait a minute, something doesn't fit. Yep. Something doesn't fit. And I started looking into it a little bit more. And around this time, is probably around the time, I guess, no, it was probably about 10 years later that I actually went back for a PhD in nutrition. But I began questioning then about whether or not what we had been told about fat was as true as we thought it was.
Yeah.
And when you look at what we've been told and why we've been told it, if you went into a cocktail party anywhere in the Western world and you said to people, why should you not eat saturated fat? Why are animal products bad? Guaranteed 9 out of 10 people are going to say, because of cholesterol.
Sure.
What if cholesterol wasn't the bugaboo we thought it was? What if it wasn't the risk factor we thought it was? What if we had been looking under the wrong street lamp to find the keys, if you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
What happens to the dietary guidelines? Because they are based 100% on the fear of what will happen to your cholesterol. It's the only reason. And if that weren't the case, maybe our dietary guidelines are screwed.
Yeah, back to the drawing board.
So at this point now, so I had been wondering about the wisdom of our conventional wisdom on fat going back to the early 90s. I wrote The Great Cholesterol Myth with cardiologist Stephen Sinatra in 2012. But at least for 10 years, I've been thinking there's something wrong with this equation because it's just not being borne out. And when we really, and so that's my interest in cholesterol really came out of my weight loss clients.
Yep.
Because I'm trying to put them on a eating program that's going to match their metabolism and actually work for them, but I'm being fought by their doctors on every single step of the way because we're telling them to eat fat and less carbs. And
right.
That's going against all the conventional wisdom. So I go back and I get a PhD. Now I know what I'm talking about. Now I say, doctors, I thought you were full of it before. I still think you're full of it. And now I've got the initials after my name to prove it. So me and a number of people, by the way, have done that. I don't want to get too far into tangents, but probably the best book on diabetes, or one of the greatest experts on diabetes, is Richard Bernstein. He's an MD, and he wrote The Diabetes Diet. And he's written a number of books on it. And he's kind of the guru of diabetes and insulin resistance and stuff. One of the forefathers. And he was an electrical engineer. Yeah. And he kept going to his doctors who kept saying, well, either more carbs, more insulin. He had diabetes, and they were giving him this advice. It didn't make sense to his engineering brain. He started questioning it. They said, well, you don't know what you're talking about. We're doctors. And he said, and he got his MD, and he said, you still don't know what you're talking about. And he became a guru who says basically what I'm saying. So
it's amazing how our experience is really the best teacher, and it fires up your passion, because I know that you've been passionate about this subject. It just...
it's not that I'm so passionate about cholesterol. I'm passionate about knocking bullies off their bully pulpit. And a lot of doctors are bullies. We know best. What you say doesn't matter. Yeah. We know, and this is what you do. And really, I don't want to paint all physicians with that brush, obviously. But that tends to be endemic in the medical profession. It is extremely conservative, very, very opposed to new ideas that upset the apple cart, and it becomes a kind of a bully pulpit in a way. And that's what I don't like: bully pulpits and misinformation.
No. So you saw this contradiction, if you like, and thought this doesn't add up. So that got you hooked.
So now we start looking at research, because it's interesting how the Great Cholesterol Myth book came about. Was I had written a book that was very successful. Thank you, audiences. 150 Healthiest Foods on Earth. And the 150 Healthiest Foods on Earth, which just was published in its 10th anniversary edition, all updated, and you can get it in England. And publishers like series, just like movie producers like Die Hard 1, Die Hard 2, Fast and Furious 6, Fast and Furious 7. So we have this 150 Healthiest Foods. They wanted a series, and we did a series, 150 most effective ways to live longer, and there was a lot of 150s. So they come to me with the idea, we've got the idea for the next book. How about the 150 best ways to lower your cholesterol? And I said, I'm not the guy to write that book, because I think cholesterol is a crock. I don't think that's what the target should be. And they said, what are you talking about? The entire world thinks that lowering cholesterol. And I said, well, they're wrong. And I don't believe that. And there's good evidence to support the alternative belief to this.
Absolutely.
After much discussion, they agreed to publish the book, provided I had a cardiologist co-author and that he was internationally known. They were not going to publish some cockamamie book going against the medical profession by some nutritionist. So Sinatra and I rolled up our sleeves, Steve Sinatra, and we wrote this book, and we researched it. And when I started looking at the research, it confirmed what I had suspected. And these studies are in the book. They are referenced in the book. They are on PubMed. You can look them up. They're not fake news. Half of all people admitted to American hospitals for cardiovascular events, normal cholesterol. Well, that doesn't make it a pretty good predictor as far as I'm concerned.
No.
Many people die with normal cholesterol. We have a very famous TV host in America who ran Meet the Press, the oldest television show on the died on the treadmill at the NBC studios. Perfectly normal cholesterol.
Right.
There were things that were not adding up here. One of my favorite studies that I quote in the book is the Lean diet heart study done in France. And here's what they did. I'll tell it to you quickly because you can follow my puzzlement at these kinds of fats. So here they took 605 people who were walking nightmares. These were insurance underwriters' nightmares. They had every risk factor you can think of. They were overweight, they smoked, they ate crummy food, they had high blood, just terrible. Mostly men. And they divided them into two groups, and one group got the standard American, what they call the prudent diet. Keep your saturated fat to 7%. The calories, 30% from calories should be for fat, no more. 60% should be carbohydrates. Don't eat eggs, all the stuff you talked about. Standard advice. The other group got coaching in the Mediterranean diet, which was considerably higher in fat.
Yeah.
And at the, and was still a very novel concept. Wow, olive oil, isn't that fattening? So we've moved from there since it's been 20 years since the study. But here's what's really, really great. So the people on the Mediterranean diet did so phenomenally well that they had to stop the study because they thought it was unethical. People just stopped dying on the Mediterranean diet, right? And that's the take-home that everyone takes from the Lean diet. But there's a secret little piece of data in the Lean diet heart study that I noticed.
Okay, what was that?
Yes, everybody did much better. And everybody stopped dying at a phenomenal rate, so much so that they stopped the study. But what do you think happened to their cholesterol? When they started with the study, 605 people, these people all had high cholesterol and they had smoking and the high blood. What do you think happened to their cholesterol, these people on the Mediterranean diet who stopped dying?
I'm going to take a guess. Either it stayed pretty constant or maybe it even dropped. It wouldn't surprise me if it dropped.
It didn't budge.
It didn't budge, okay.
It was irrelevant.
Okay.
It stopped dying.
Okay, that's the best outcome you can have, isn't it?
Sorry, I think it was a success. They stopped dying. Well, what happened to their cholesterol? It didn't budge. Well, then, no, it's a marker. It doesn't really tell us everything we think it tells us.
In fact, it seems like a misleading marker, in fact, yeah?
It's particularly misleading, Nigel, in the way it's measured, because there is some valuable information in cholesterol measurements, but not in the old test that looks at good and bad cholesterol. Okay. I don't know what you guys use over there now. They still use the good and bad. They divide it into HDL, which is, I think these are misnomers. I think they're oversimplifications, but they call HDL the good cholesterol, and LDL is the bad cholesterol. Okay, here's the problem. That was really good in 1962. We now know there are 5 kinds of HDL. There's HDL2A, there's HDL2B. There's 5 or more kinds of LDL. I don't think they've even figured out all of them, but they know that there are at least 5, and 2 of them are really important, LDL-A and LDL-B, and they behave very, very differently in the body. So to prescribe drugs based on this gross measurement, which is out of date, when they don't look at the actual subfractions, what we call the subfractions, how much of that LDL that their doctor's writing a prescription on is LDL-A? Oh, he doesn't know? Well, then what's he writing the prescription for?
Yeah,
because the only LDL that's bad is LDL-B. And if you don't look at that, and that test has been around for over 10 years, probably longer, then you're not looking at the data. And you're prescribing a drug that has a lot of side effects to people who may not need it.
Yeah.
So...
Johnny, could we maybe just define what cholesterol is for those listeners who might yet not know? We know it's some kind of lipid molecule, I should say. It's a kind of fat.
It's a sterol. It's a sterol, which is just a fatty, waxy molecule, and it's needed. It's an essential molecule. It's needed for the immune system and needed for the brain.
Okay.
And which is why in our country anyway, we had a big lobbying effort by doctors and, well, really funded by the pharmaceutical companies to say, hey, we got to get these kids are getting obese, we got to get them early. Let's put 13-year-olds on statin drugs to lower their cholesterol. You want to see me have my head explode, you're about to. This is medical malpractice.
Absolutely.
Because this is your full frontal cortex doesn't come online till you're about 25. So you got a developing brain, and you are now going to take away one of the main molecules needed for the functioning of that brain in the service of reducing a risk factor that isn't even that much of a risk factor.
Indeed.
That's medical malpractice.
Yeah, no, that's shocking. I mean, and in the light of the fact that there's so much evidence that I'm sure you'll share with us that this conclusion is wrong anyway, and also the fact that steroids haven't actually made heart disease go away, have they? I mean, what are the statistics what are the statistics that back up their desire to expand the prescription of statins?
There are obviously the drug companies who fund the majority of the studies that are done.
Yeah. Have
data that show a reduction in deaths from heart disease in specific populations. What's not as well publicized is that those same studies often tend to show an increase in diabetes and cancer.
Okay.
And they don't necessarily show much of a decrease of deaths, which is really what we care about, in populations other than middle-aged men with previous heart disease. That's the population for which statins have shown a modest benefit. If you're a middle-aged guy, you're 38 to 42, in that range, you had one heart attack, statin, probably not the worst thing you could be on. I think there are other choices, but we were accused by a number of outside groups of being anti-statin. They wrote a protest letter to Dr. Oz. I mean, all this stuff, right? Oh, these guys, we're not anti, we're anti-over-prescription of a drug that is not without side effects, that's being given to kids, to old men who have absolutely no benefit from it, to women who is very questionable whether or not it's beneficial, and they're just giving them out like candy, but they do have this modest benefit in this one population. And what that's called is secondary prevention. Why is it called secondary prevention? Because you had one heart attack, we want to prevent the second. Secondary prevention. But primary prevention, you're a guy who's basically healthy, you have had no heart disease, but we're going to put it on just in case. It doesn't really show much benefit for that.
No.
And yet that's how it's being used.
Well, when I learned that cholesterol was essential for the synthesis of vitamin D, for example, in the body.
Oh my God.
And aren't some of the hormones also made from cholesterol? I mean, that makes me sit up and think, well, is anybody ever going to benefit from statins, something that lowers your cholesterol, or from being advised to reduce your cholesterol? It seems to me that something that's so necessary for even cell wall structures, so many uses. I'm sure you can fill us in on a few more. How could it be good to reduce your cholesterol level?
The thing with statin drugs is it's an interesting thing that they do have a mild anti-inflammatory effect.
Right.
And they also have a mild blood thinning effect. Now let's talk about those are two good things. I don't think they're the best things to do that, but they do that. Mm-hmm. Ufi Riskovnov, who is the father of the cholesterol skepticism, thing that I didn't start this. We just wrote a book that's user friendly, but these guys have been writing about this. Props to the guys who came up with this, and for 20 years they've been talking about this, but mostly to each other in academic circles. They're difficult books to read. They're not accessible. But they've been saying the same thing. But Ufi, who's the father of this, he's an MD PhD from Sweden. He's the master of it. He says, statin drugs would be a better drug if they didn't lower cholesterol. If they just left cholesterol alone and were mildly anti-inflammatory and anti-platelet aggregation, fine. The cholesterol lowering is irrelevant. Now, here's what's interesting about that. In our book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, and in other books I've written, I've identified what I think are four major promoters of disease, and certainly heart disease, but actually, if you look at it, there's not a degenerative disease that is not promoted in some way. Amplified, promoted, not always caused, but certainly aggravated by these four factors. Number one with the bullet is inflammation. Heart disease, in many ways, is a disease of inflammation. And So we need all the anti-inflammatory power we can get from food and supplements. Unfortunately, for some people, statins are the only thing they're getting, but I would argue that fish oil blows statins out of the water in terms of its anti-inflammatory power. It doesn't lower cholesterol, but who cares? It lowers something that is actually probably more germane to heart disease than cholesterol.
So you're saying fish oil for the omega-3s as opposed to the omega-6s, the more inflammatory oils, is that the reason?
That's exactly the reason. The balance between omega-6s, which can be pro-inflammatory when they're overconsumed, and omega-3s, which are always anti-inflammatory, that balance is critical. That balance has been researched all over the place. Our Paleolithic ancestors got about a 1-to-1 relationship. Mm-hmm. We get 16-to-1. And in some parts of the country, 20-to-1 or 25-to-1. So it's not that omega-6s are bad, they're an essential fatty acid, but you need them balanced with the omega-3s. When you have 15 times as much omega-6, which everybody who buys processed food is getting, which everybody who uses corn oil and soybean oil and safflower oil and all the good vegetarian oil, they're all getting an overdose of omega-6s and they're not getting enough. No wonder we have inflammation as a major crisis. Time magazine, one of our national magazines here, did a cover story called Inflammation, the Silent Killer. It is. So of course, the omega-3s make a big difference with that because they help balance. These omega-3 supplements and wild salmon, things like that, help balance the overconsumption of pro-inflammatory omega-6s.
Right, so inflammation then a key factor in heart disease, which is what you're going on to say,
Key factor is key with a Sharpie underlining it 3 times. That's how key it is. And it's interesting that just the other day I was interviewed by a publication who wanted me to comment on a new study that showed that omega-3 status in your blood is a better predictor of heart disease than cholesterol. And I said, well, what took you so long to figure that out? That was my comment. I mean, yes, it's like, is this supposed to be surprising? It's not surprising to any of us.
So I guess there are all sorts of other inflammatory things in our diet that we should also watch for as well. I mean, you've obviously highlighted the important ones. Additives and sugar. I wouldn't mind betting you're going to go on to talk about sugar. But
sugar is one of the most inflammatory substances I know of. In fact, I was speaking to a geneticist, a biochemist and geneticist, about certain genes that predispose us to inflammation. Mm-hmm. And he said, and you know, the most inflammatory substance of all is sugar. So this isn't unknown information.
No, it's not new.
And it's not the only thing. Drugs can be inflammatory. Omega-6s, as we just talked about, are highly inflammatory, especially in the absence of enough omega-3s to balance it out. Stress is very inflammatory. So even mental things like anxiety and stress and stuff, lack of sleep, all of these can be inflammatory. The air we breathe, the toxins we're exposed to, the stuff that's in our food, the preservatives and the fungi and bacteria, all the stuff that we get in that isn't endogenous to us that could be considered toxins or pesticides, they all are inflammatory. So we've got an influx of this stuff, and no wonder our anti-inflammatory army that we have in our bodies, which are made from omega-3s, no wonder they're outnumbered. They can't, it's a battle between these two. We want them in balance, and the omega-3 army is being underfunded.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I mean, I've heard it said also that leaky gut can add to one's chronic exposure to inflammatory influences. With all sorts of things actually triggering the immune system that shouldn't be there.
100% true.
So go on.
Again, when you talk to people at cocktail parties, how's your heart? How's your health? The first thing they're going to tell you is the cholesterol level. And one of the things that makes me that I'm upset about this is not that I think it's theoretically wrong, but it also makes people feel complacent. Like, oh, my cholesterol is under control. I'm fine. I'm on a statin drug, and you're not. You're not taking. That's not taking care of your heart. That's the most look. I don't want to overstate the case that cholesterol has no role in anything. It clearly has some positive roles, and certain damaged cholesterol, oxidized cholesterol, LDL-B, those little particles that are really nasty, they have some problems. But to me, this is the example I always use. We're attacked on 9/11. We decide to put all our political capital in. We're going to go after the terrorists. We get together and we say, where should be our first target? Portugal. there's a terrorist in his mother's basement in Portugal. I think we should go after Well, there may be a terrorist in his mother's basement, but is that's really what you want to put your capital on, Portugal? And that's what we've done with cholesterol. I'm not saying that we don't need to monitor this and look at it, and that in certain configurations like high LDLB, low LDLA, small particles rather than certain configurations, it can be a risk factor to be looked at. But we have put our entire army on this one guy in Portugal instead of looking at the vast armies that are out to get us, like inflammation, oxidative damage, stress, all these things that create the conditions for heart disease. And we're not even looking at them because we're focused on this one guy in his basement in Portugal. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely disproportionate focus. So just to summarize. Just to summarise those points you made, then the key factors of heart disease, you mentioned inflammation,
oxidative damage, and that is like free radical damage. Because do you want me to tell you what that is, or that's something?
Yeah, please do.
So oxidative damage, the best way to explain what that is, free radical damage, is take an apple, cut up some slices, put it on a picnic table, leave it out in the sun, and look at it at the end of the day. It's going to be brown. It's going to have brown spots, right, from being out in the sun and the oxygen. If you have some metal in your, and you leave it out in the rain, eventually it has to have rust. That's oxidative damage. That's the damage oxygen does when it interacts with things. And the reason it does that damage is something called free radicals, and oxygen-free radicals. And they're molecules that have essentially gone rogue.
Okay. So
all of these molecules, these electrons, usually travel in pairs. And once in a while, one gets away from the group, and now he's looking for so he starts literally dinging on your cells and your DNA and damaging them, constantly looking for another pair. And if he gets a pair, then that other one that's now free, that's a free radical. And that free radical damage, we can see it on the apple that we leave out. We can see it on our skin. Oxygen damage and sun damage, we can see, sunspots. There's a lot of things where we can actually visually see it, but what we can't see is the damage it does to our cells and our DNA. So oxidative damage is a huge problem. Oxidated cholesterol, when cholesterol becomes oxidated, like if you were to scramble eggs and leave them out under a hot light and a buffet for like a couple of hours, I wouldn't touch those. Because now you're eating oxidized cholesterol. I don't care about, I'll drink the eggs raw, but oxidized cholesterol, keep it away. And when it gets oxidized in the body, it can be a problem, not because it's cholesterol, because anything that's oxidized is not good. So, is damaged by oxidation. Mm-hmm. So that's the other one, and we're exposed to those all the time, free radical everywhere. Stress, which doesn't get nearly enough respect, if you will, or acknowledgement for its causal and promotional effects in disease. Mm-hmm. Stress makes everything worse. It can bring on episodes of certain diseases, for example, herpes. If stress brings on herpes attacks, brings on skin blemishes, it brings on hair loss. There's a lot of things that can be triggered by stress. Yeah. Stress makes recovery longer from almost any disease. It just does a lot of really bad things when it is chronic and uncontrolled, which is the way it is normally.
It's like the straw that breaks the camel's back, isn't it? The stress tips you over the edge.
More than the straw. In many cases, it's one of the contributing factors. Let me just grab that and make sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem.
Sorry, folks.
No worries. So, what was their fourth one?
Fourth is sugar.
Okay.
Sugar, which for various reasons, many of them political, and many of them that have since come to light in articles that have exposed how the sugar industry actually hired scientists or put different doctors on retainer to cast doubt on the prevailing on any implication of sugar in any of these problems, and to focus on fat and to support research looking at fat as the culprit, because they did not want anyone looking at sugar as the culprit in heart disease. And interesting enough, in your country, this is a really interesting part. So we had this fat hypothesis going on. We had this guy, Ansel Keys, who was absolutely convinced that fat is what causes heart disease, and fat is what we should make the dietary guidelines eliminate. And he was a very powerful guy with a lot of clout. And even though there were a lot of objections to what he was saying, he managed to get those guidelines passed and make that kind of policy. But there was a guy in your country named John Yudkin, who was a professor emeritus at Queen's, I've forgotten the name of the very prestigious college there, and he was a professor emeritus of nutrition. And Yudkin had a completely different theory. Yudkin thought it was sugar. And Yudkin battled Keyes from across the pond. And he would say, he wrote an article in The Lancet. He said, look at this data you've got there, Ansel Keyes. You're tracking fat, but we've tracked nutrients, and nothing tracks better than sugar. Sugar is the one that tracks with all this, way better than fat. And they literally had, luckily there wasn't Twitter then, but Keyes attacked him the way Trump attacks opponents.
Yeah.
He did it in whatever the media was then. Oh, he's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Oh, he's a fake. He's being paid by whatever it was. There were really vicious attacks on Yudkin. So you had these two hypotheses. You had Yudkin over in your country saying, dude, we should be looking at sugar. And you had Ansel Keys saying, no, it's fat. And the wrong theory won. That's basically what happened. Kind of like what happened over here with our presidential elections. The wrong guy won.
To the bitter cost of the health of I don't know, thousands, hundreds and thousands of people. I mean, it's quite frightening when you think of the consequences of wrong advice prescribed across generations of people eating the wrong stuff, foregoing eggs as possibly one of the most nutritious meals you could have.
Fantastic food.
Yeah. Okay, so Johnny, so you've given us those four factors for heart disease. Maybe we could just revisit, just clarify the particle size issue with cholesterol, because a lot of people have heard of the particle size being an issue, and the LDL-A and the large fluffy ones. Maybe you could just throw some light on all.
Think of it like large fluffy is a good way to just so LDL, the quote unquote bad, the one that used to get painted with the brush. This is all bad stuff. If you look a little more carefully with more modern technology that they didn't have back in 1960s when they were coming up with the HDL and LDL, you see that actually LDL isn't all the same. Some of it looks like cotton balls, and cotton balls don't do much damage. Some of them look like BB gun pellets. They're hard, little oxidized, nasty little. They can do some damage. If you don't know which is which, then you're really not looking at the full amount of data that's available from your cholesterol measurement. You're looking at an antiquated measure that just grossly says left and right instead of saying, wait a minute, there's some subgroups in here. Let's look at what those are doing. I always use the example that if I had an LDL, here's what most American doctors, and probably in the Western world, would consider an LDL of 140, 150 to be very high and troublesome. Mm-hmm. I always say if I had an LDL, and under 100 to be really good, if I had under 100 and the vast majority of them were the nasty small particles, I would be worried, even though my doctor wouldn't be.
Right.
If I had 140, but they were all the cotton balls, I couldn't care less, and my doctor would be putting me on a prescription. You gotta look at the particles.
Right. And my understanding is that if you eat lots of butter and lots of the healthy fats, being very careful about what fat, you do end up with this massive profile shift. So you get all this large fluffy LDL, and I'll leave it to you, but you get a much better profile, don't you, that indicates actually, things aren't looking too bad for your health.
That's exactly right. You got it. You explained it beautifully. I'll repeat it just so they can hear it twice, but that's 100% true. And that is information that is completely absent from the conventional test. So what you're basically saying, what Nigel just said is, these particles, the big cotton balls, you want more of those, and the nasty little BB gun pellets, you don't want many of those. Well, saturated fat actually changes the population. It moves it more towards the fluffy ones and less towards the BB guns. And we've known this since the 90s. There's research anyone can look up. The author is Dreon, D-R-E-O-N. It's in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Saturated fat changes particle size. Look it up. Not a fake news. So it's just stuff that, doctors don't know. They just don't know.
No, it seems to me that these days that more and more, lay people seem to know more than their doctor on this issue. So there is hope.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
There is then hope for people who might be concerned about the cholesterol issue for a start, get an accurate test. Are there tests available to get? You mentioned up to 5 different particle sizes, but is there a specific test that people can get?
It's called the particle test.
The particle test.
Okay. Particle test. Yeah. That's all. And it looks as total number of particles also is a risk factor, probably way more than just the amount of cholesterol. Mm-hmm. You want fewer because you want those big fluffy ones, and they're going to occupy more space, and so fewer particles is better than lots of molecules. But this old-fashioned left and right, good and bad, is just silly. It's just silly.
Outdated. And there's also the issue, of course, that dietary cholesterol, as I understand it, if you reduce your intake of cholesterol, your body produces more of it in the liver anyway, and vice versa. Is that perhaps you can shed some light on that?
100% true. Dietary cholesterol never was a problem, and only recently, finally, in a tiny baby step, the governing bodies of our country and the governing authorities of our country, the advisory committee, said, okay, cholesterol in the diet's not a nutrient of concern.
Right.
I never thought it was, but now even they say, don't worry. Now, there is a tiny population, so anyone listening to this, who has a genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia. They were born with high cholesterol. They look at an egg and their cholesterol goes into the 500s. This is a genetic thing. It's a small population. If you have that, you need to talk to your doctor. Those cases have to be treated very specially. It's not my specialty, but I know that in some cases they will limit dietary cholesterol because the body does not respond like yours and mine does, and it's a specific genetic condition. But for 95% of people, dietary cholesterol means 0.0%, means nothing.
Okay, a completely ineffective marker to be happily
Dietary
disregarded.
cholesterol, the doctors who are still telling people not to eat eggs because or shellfish because of cholesterol have not opened a journal article in the last 15 years.
Okay, so out there then, the general consensus, the scientific consensus anyway, do you think that's shifted significantly towards accepting that cholesterol is not the bogeyman? Is it just the sort of the lag factor in your average doctor or GP sort of catching up with this, or do you think there's still some institutional weight behind perpetuating the myth?
There's massive institutional weight. The American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, the government guidelines, they have not budged, except for the government guidelines saying, okay, we don't have to worry too much about cholesterol in your eggs. But the basic idea that this is the number one thing, and that this much, and saturated fat should always be low, and all of those things, they haven't really budged. Now, if you tell me on the ground, are doctors beginning to change? I'd say they are beginning to. There's always been a small core of physicians who are also educated in nutrition. There's not many of them, but there are core. And there are doctors who are educated in something called functional medicine, which is a way of looking at the body as everything is interrelated. It's a postdoctoral. After they're already medical doctors, and functional medicine doctors tend to look at it this way. Naturopathic doctors tend to look at it this way. But the vast majority, this is still absolute dogma, and questioning it is what I have noticed. Even among some of those, is a slight relaxation on the primacy of cholesterol. They don't budge on how important it is, on that it matters, and it's, but they've kind of shifted away from spotlighting and said, well, yeah, that's only one of many factors. So there is a slight shift, but in general, these kind of things take decades to really shift.
So maybe we can tie this in with another one of your books and another important issue, the sort of the low carb question, because there's been a lot of research that has shown quite convincingly that if we reduce our sugar, which of course means all the starchy carbohydrates instead of the fibrous vegetables and things. If we actually reduce sugar, there are many health benefits, not least triglycerides reducing and all that sort of stuff. So were you sort of led on into the low carb, and what's your general view of low carb? And also, do you think it's important in terms of lowering sugar to also reduce things like potatoes, rice, pasta, and all the other wheat-based carbs, obviously not potatoes, but to keep the blood sugar down for that reason?
You see, people get confused when they talk about just reducing sugar. The foods you just mentioned, potatoes, bread, pasta, they convert to sugar before they even get to the stomach. You might as well take the sugar container and pour it down your throat. So I'm exaggerating, but only for effect, but just a little bit. They are essentially converting to sugar. There is a scale. I don't think it's used as much now because we use the glycemic load, but the glycemic index is still probably, I think it's obsolete by the glycemic load, which is more accurate. Mm-hmm. But glycemic index used to measure, still does measure, the impact of a portion of a food, glucose, pure glucose, sugar, liquid, and measured against that to see how fast and how your blood sugar rises when you eat this food and how long it stays up. And that would be put into a metric called the glycemic index. White bread has a higher glycemic index than sugar. In some of the studies, they just use white bread as the standard instead of sugar because it takes it off the chart. So, yeah, this old notion of simple carbohydrates and complex is BS. What we want to know is how fast does it raise blood sugar, and unfortunately, almost every one of the foods you mentioned raises blood sugar very high.
So does that lead you, along with the low carb thing? Is that why, for example, you felt or you support the general low carb eating? I know that's quite a broad church, and we probably have to.
The last 10 years of my career, I think, have been all moving towards realizing the infinite variability of human beings, their metabolism, their hormones, their belief system, which influences their immune system. I mean, all of it. Mm-hmm. So to pin, an epidemic of disease on one nutrient or one factor, it seems to me short-sighted because there's a lot of things here. So that said, I do believe, I cheat on carbohydrates. I love carbohydrates, but I think that part of the study of your own metabolism and seeing how all these factors work is understanding what you can tolerate, what you feel best on, what you can cheat on, what you can't cheat on, what your body. On the other hand, I have a zero tolerance for alcohol. So for me, perfectly good for you, really has health benefits. For me, 0.0 ever in my diet. And some people are like that with sugar. I don't want to say that everyone is.
No.
I think sugar has no particular health value, but it has a lot of social value. It's in foods we love. And I don't know that everyone in the world has to eliminate that stuff. I think we need to be sensitive to the huge variation in individual metabolism. That said, the high-carb diet is a bad diet historically. Think about it. We only invented agriculture 10,000 years ago. We've been on our progenitors, the human genus, not Homo sapiens. They're about 110,000 years old, but the human genus that we came from, 2.4 million years on this planet. 10,000 for agriculture. So you do a 24-hour clock. We've been on high carb for like a second. Well, most of the time we were on the planet, we hunted, we fished, and we gathered. So if it grew wild, if it fell off a tree, if you could hunt it or fish it, that's what you ate.
Yeah.
That's the natural diet of human beings. This craziness with processed food is 100 years old.
Yeah. So we're just not genetically adapted to it, are we?
Even if you want to count from Homo sapiens, we've been here 100,000 years. McDonald's been here since 1957. Which one do you think is the fad diet? That's why it kills me when they say low carb, that's a fad. No, dude, that's not a fad. What you're talking about is completely recent in human memory. No one ever consumed this amount of sugar ever.
No.
Ever.
One little question with the sugar. I've heard it said previously that fructose, one of the forms of sugar, obviously there's maltose, dextrose, lactose, and all these other forms of sugar, glucose being the main one, that fructose, which I understand to be quite prominent in fresh fruits, that's particularly bad. And I think is it Robert Lustig did some research on this. Can you shed any light on that? Do you say avoid fructose, therefore keep your fruit intake sensible?
Fructose has unique properties that glucose doesn't have. And the fructose component of sugar may wind up turning out to be probably the most damaging of the two. As you said, table sugar is glucose and fructose 50-50. Problem is, fructose is a lot sweeter and a lot cheaper. So manufacturers started getting rid of the sugar, which was too expensive, not in every case, but in many cases, and using a special blend called high fructose corn syrup, made from GMO corn and extra fructose, and you had this blend where it's even more fructose. And now the health people, especially the vegans, are propagandizing about agave nectar. Wow, that's terrific. It's natural. It's vegan. No, it's 92% fructose. So it's even worse. So this fructose load and the amount of fructose that we consume simply because of the amount of sugar that we now consume is very, very problematic for the liver. And it does a lot of things that will probably be too complicated to go into or too wordy, but basically it's really not good for you. Now, let's be very clear about the difference between fructose from an apple and the high fructose corn syrup that's in your bagel. or in your cereal, or in your pasta, or in your sweetened protein bar, or any of the rest of it. A small amount of fructose found naturally in fruits and vegetables and surrounded with pectin for fiber and flavonoids and vitamins and 8,000 other things in the plant kingdom, all together in a pan, a lot of water. So, for example, in an apple, it's mostly water, a little bit of fructose, a lot of, anti-inflammatories like quercetin, a lot of vitamins like vitamin C. To consume a small amount of fructose in fruit is very different than eating a diet in which high fructose corn syrup is a major ingredient. Gotcha. Now, that said, there are people, again, we talked about metabolic individuality and how everyone's different. There are people, and certainly people who have significant problems with carbohydrate metabolism, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, people who are on that spectrum, who do need to limit fruit. Yeah. Because they're so sensitive, just like the people who have familial hypercholesterolemia, they do maybe have to watch the cholesterol in their foods because they have a particular problem. But for most people, I compare the fruit. I mean, again, you probably don't want to overdo it. And fruits and vegetables have probably got the edge in terms of nutrients versus sugar. I mean, but I'm not really frightened of fruit. I think we have much bigger dietary problems, and I just, that's not the target. Although there is a subpopulation who their fruit's going to screw them up because they just can't metabolize any sugar.
Great. Well, that's reassuring to get a little bit of the thumbs up on fruit in terms of reducing our sugar. I came across the term, carbohydrate intolerance. I was looking into some work by Steve Finney and Jeff Volek, and the idea of people, some of us being genetically predisposed to not doing well, or you could say doing even worse on the high carb diet with all the refined wheat products and all that sort of stuff, and the obesity and the heart disease happening around about the 5th decade. And so it does seem that there's a lot of merit in reducing the carbs, and I mean, not the Atkins diet, because there are one or two variables that he didn't perhaps pay attention to. But so you're an advocate of the low carb approach and healthy fats.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. What was the rest? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No problem. So you would advocate, keeping the refined carbs down, and obviously a sensible, healthy fat diet along the lines of the paleo model. I think you're broadly in line with that, aren't you, Johnny?
I am. I mean, here's what I'd say to that. I think you have to start somewhere with a template, right? Like, okay, what's the template? Now let's customize it. Whether you're buying a house from a kit or you're buying a car and we put the air conditioning in, we're going to tint the windows. I think you got to start with a template, though. You got to start with the car you like, and then you can add the things. I think a good template is a lower carb template, one that is more reflective of our ancestry, our shared human ancestry. Before we get into all the specifics that this group might be genetically adapted to more carbs and this one is not adapted to alcohol. We know that there are ethnic groups that just do not detoxify alcohol very well, and they have much higher rates of alcoholism because the same alcohol given to someone with that genetic profile and given to someone with a different genetic profile is not going to produce the same result. And the same thing may be true for sugar. So some people may be more genetically, but I don't want people to think if I don't have that gene, I'm not in trouble, because you can do that damage to your body even if you have great genes. If you eat processed carbohydrates from morning to night, or even a majority of them in the standard American diet, the sad standard American diet, which is we've exported all over the world. I was in Beijing, China. They got KFCs and McDonald's all up and down the main streets. So, and guess what? And a growing obesity problem. Yeah. And so if you eat that stuff long enough, you will do the damage. You don't need bad genes. Now, if you have on top of it not such great genes, then you're really screwed. But don't think because you are genetically sound that you can't undo that genetic advantage by eating really bad food for a long time.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I'm very aware of time now, Johnny, so maybe we should wrap it up there. Just here's a quick reminder here of this book, wonderful book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, written by Johnny and co-written with Dr. Stephen Sinatra. And also, I recommend, I haven't got it with me, a copy here, but Low Carb Living, another very interesting read.
Living Low Carb, yeah, thank you.
Living Low Carb, I beg your pardon. Yeah, marvellous stuff. So thank you very much for joining us today, taking the time, Dr. Bowden, and thank you all for listening. We do hope you got some value from the show today. And please feel free to leave a comment or join in the conversation. And please do join me once again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.